Good morning. I haven't been up here in a long time doing a message. Actually, I was thinking about it. It was last year, the last time I was up here. So I'm figuring, I think I remember how to do it. I'm hoping it's, a lot like riding a bike. So it should be no problem. So today's a standalone message, and that means we're not in a series. It's just the message today. But like a lot of days, we want to consult an expert. We want to see, and often we look to who is our consulting theologian today. And I think you guys are going to know this one. His name is Dr. Charles Brown, and you probably know this theologian. And what profound theological statement does Dr. Brown, not to be confused with our other theologian, Dr. Brown, what statement does he make that we would know? Anybody know? What does he say a lot? Good grief. Good grief. So, when I was thinking about this message, when you get this thing, if you're a note taker, I think, Andy, you need to click into the slide because I can't. Clicker's not working. If you're a note taker, often you'll have the title of the message and then there's little blanks to fill in. Well, today, the title even has a blank to fill in, and that's because I didn't want anybody to see the title because then they might leave before the message. Because the title is Facing Loss. Facing loss. And, when you think about facing loss, we go back to good grief. Good grief, two meanings. Good grief meaning it's good, there's something good about grief. And the other one is good grief. Like, really, Dave? You're going to talk about this? I mean, we've had Good Friday, and, that is a sad time. But then there's the resurrection and Easter Sunday, and we get on this trajectory, and it's going to be great, and we just keep going. And now Dave comes, and good grief. And honestly, that was my reaction, too, because as Joe said, hey, it's a standalone, talk about whatever you want within, certain boundaries. And so as I was thinking about something to talk about, I don't often get this, but I had a really strong impression from the Lord to say, I want you to talk about loss and grief. And I'm like, I don't want to do that. And I told Linda, I said, I think the Lord wants me to talk about loss and grief, but I'm not gonna. And she goes, I don't think that's a good idea. I said, probably not. And then I'd have to do a message on obedience. Not that I think there's something wrong with the topic, because I absolutely think it's very essential and a very good thing to talk about. But it was just something about the timing of it and everything else that, part of me wanted to not go there. But we're going there. And my hope and my prayer is that it's there for somebody today that will be helpful for them. So, a statement. Sadness is central to finding happiness. Who in the world would say that? Well, a couple of psychologists that wrote a book called The Positive Power of Sadness. It's a husband and wife. They have different last names, but they're both psychologists. And they have had their own loss and grief with their daughter and a disease, and then with their clients. But as they were looking at this idea of sadness and loss and grief, they found that there's really something important to facing it in a way that's helpful and it's good for us. So they say this. They say sadness is a natural feeling to have when we have lost something. And the failure to feel sadness has dire consequences. It is not only natural, but it is also necessary for a person to face loss, feel loss, recover from loss, and most importantly, improve as a person as the result of loss and recovery. So they found something really positive about it. But we could say, but they're psychologists. Those people, can we really trust those people? As I'm one of those group, I can say that. But what about Jesus? What did he say about facing loss? And what did that look like for him? And, hundreds and hundreds of years ago, the prophet Isaiah foresaw what Jesus would be like as he walked the earth. And he described him. And he says this. He says, he was despised and forsaken of men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. He was a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. It didn't say he was a man who ran away from sorrow and grief, a man who stuffed it down, a man who tried to outrun it, a man who tried to outwork it, a man who tried to medicate it. It says he was acquainted with it. It was part of him. And then in his teaching, the Sermon on the Mount, there's the Beatitudes. Those are the blesseds. And, he says, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. And an even more literal translation from the original Greek says this, happy morning, for you shall be comforted. Happy morning. And one writer talking about this beatitude says this. He says, in this beatitude, Jesus praises the weeping class, those who can enter into solidarity with the pain of the world and not try to extract themselves from it. So there's something about Jesus saying, and what this author is saying is that we need to somehow be in solidarity and grab onto and not try to pull out of facing our loss and the grief that comes with it. So if Jesus is saying it's a good thing to do, how do we do it? How do we face losses? Because often there's a lot of them. And one sales website says this. It says, for the best results, don't wing it, follow a process. Don't wing it, follow a process. So we're going to look at following some processes that I think will help us to face loss. We're going to look at 3 of them. So the first one, want to be following the process of recognizing that there are different types of loss, recognizing how it impacts us as people. And so, often when we think about going to types of loss, we often think about, well, it's mostly just death, but there's a lot of losses we grieve from. What about dreams? The loss of dreams, the dream of a job, the dream of a home, what that looks like. Maybe a house, maybe a home and the people in it. Maybe it's the dream of the family, what we thought our kids would be like when they grew up. All those dreams, sometimes those can be broken, and that brings grief. What about decisions? Making decisions that weren't good ones, and we suffer and experience the loss from that. Some of you might be experiencing loss from the decision of a race last night with some horses. What about sin? The sin in our lives and all the things that can cause. There's grief that can come with that and needs to come with that. And then, of course, there is the ultimate loss, which is death. And I say the ultimate loss because some people say who've gone through divorce or are going through divorce have told me, I think this is worse than death. And I've been through divorce myself, and I concur that it's very hard. It's like a death. And as I was thinking about my own life, and some people, if with one loss, it almost hits everything on the list. And there's way more to the list than that. I just put up a few things. But I was thinking back in my own life and during my first marriage and as a young man, I'm working as a mechanic in a truck repair business. And, it wasn't my dream job. It was something to put food on the table. My dream job was I wanted to be working at a church full-time in ministry. And that's what I thought about every day, every minute, every hour, every week, every year after year after year after year after year. And so one day that opportunity opened up, and I got an opportunity to go to a church and be full-time. And I remember just like selling a lot of my tools, giving stuff away, throwing stuff out, packing up what I had and just going, I'll never be back here. I'm going to my dream job, baby. It's going to be awesome. And, thinking about how that'll affect the family. And that I remember my son, when he was a little kid, he said, "I'm going to be a preacher." And I remember thinking, yeah, and that will happen. And I had these dreams and for all these things. And about 2 years into my dream job, I get a call one day, and I go into the office, and the head pastor was there and some elders, and they said, "Dave, we're really sorry, but we got to lay you off. We're laying off staff." There was a lot of financial issues at the church. And so I remember going home that day just, wow. And then when I got home that day, there was an answering, voice message on my machine, the old ones you push with the button. And it was my old boss from the truck repair place. And he says, "Hey, I don't know what you're doing in your life right now, but we need somebody, and I just thought I'd call you for the heck of it." And I was like, "Thank you, Lord, that you closed one door and opened another." Very thankful for that. And actually, I did want to try to be thankful for it. But oh my gosh, going back there, it was so hard. And I really didn't recognize, like I was grieving. I was going through grief of that dream. I didn't even recognize it. It's important to recognize it. And then right around that time, my wife separates. She moves out. She wants to get a divorce. My son, he doesn't really want anything to do with God. And it just seemed like everything crumbled. And there was a lot of grief. And I wish I would have recognized more at that time that that's what was going on with me, that there was grief. And so it's important to recognize it. And the second thing is to recognize the impact, how grief impacts us. I mean, it impacts us physically, it impacts us emotionally, it impacts us spiritually. And maybe some of you have heard of C.S. Lewis. He's a prolific writer. He wrote the Chronicles of Narnia. They made a movies out of that. He's written lots of books. He was an atheist that was converted to Christianity. And he didn't get married till later in life. He was a bachelor for a long time, but then he met the love of his life. And he got married, and she later died of cancer. And as he was going through this process of loss, he started journaling because he was a writer. That's what he did. And later, this personal journal got published. It's now called A Grief Observed. And, he was trying to struggle with this whole thing. And we'll see here in a minute how the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual are all affecting him in this thing. We'll see what he says in his journal. But he talked about this program. He said, "Here's the program I want to follow. Instead of feeling the intense pain, instead, when I think of my wife, I'm going to laugh. And I'm just going to, think about happy things and not do the sad stuff." So that's his program. So here's what he says. "An admirable program. Unfortunately, it can't be carried out. Tonight, all the hells of young grief have opened again. The mad words, the bitter resentment, the fluttering in the stomach, the nightmare unreality, the wallowed in tears. For in grief, nothing stays put. One keeps on emerging from a phase, but it's always recurs. Round and round, everything repeats. Am I going in circles? Or do I hope I'm on a spiritual spiral, or I'm on a spiral?" Because he was just hoping, I hope I could spiral out of this. Wow, you see it all. You see the physical, you see the emotional. When he talks about the mad words, that's the spiritual thing. He went through a spiritual crisis, as Joe has talked about, and we got the little thing in the bulletin that shows that crisis period we go to in our lives, and he went through one. And he called God a cosmic sadist. I mean, he was bitter and angry. But like Joe always says, when we're in that place, just stick with it. Don't drop out. Keep asking questions. And he did, and he eventually came out of that. But man, it impacted him greatly. And another thing we see from this journal is sort of how grief just sort of blindsides us sometimes. We think we're going along okay. What did you call it, Joanne? A grief ambush. You're just kind of going along, and boom, this wave of grief can hit you, and you're just like, man, I thought I got through all this, and there it is again. That's how grief can impact us, and it's good to recognize that. And sometimes it's easy to recognize that with a death, but not as easy when it's other types of losses. So we want to recognize in the second process is we want to be following the process of responding to grief. Responding to grief in ourselves and responding to grief that others are experiencing. So when we think about grief for ourselves, often, what happens is there's a lot of intense feelings, and we want the off switch. Just want to hit the off switch. I don't want to experience this grief. Just like C.S. Lewis, I'm going to have this program where I just laugh. Doesn't work. It's really important that we experience the feelings. And, in our culture, and I love America, not anti-American, but Americans, and this isn't just me saying this, other experts have seen this that study grief, Americans aren't very good at grieving. We're not very good in embracing those feelings. We get a lot of messages like, we got to be strong, we got to move on, we got to just keep going, and not take the time to really experience and feel the feelings. When I was a young guy working in a restaurant, I remember there was this cook named Terry. Terry had moved to the United States from Macedonia. And we were in there cooking, and there was a banquet. There was an after-funeral luncheon for a group of people who'd been to a funeral in our banquet room. And Terry kept looking in the banquet room, and then he'd do something, and he'd kind of mumble, and he'd look in again. And I'm like, what's going on with this guy? And finally he goes, what are they doing? And I looked, and I'm like, they're eating lunch? He's like, no, what are they doing? He said, someone died. And I'm like, yeah, it's, a funeral luncheon. He goes, they're laughing. And this guy was distraught. He says, in my country, you pull your hair out. You cry, you mourn, you take days, and he's going on and on. I was like, wow. And I don't think it's wrong to laugh at those times. But what he was saying is, when we study all other cultures, you see that, some cultures just block out a lot of time to be able to feel and experience and not try to stuff it down and just go on. So it's super important to embrace and turn the feeling switch on and let yourself feel those. When Jesus walked the earth, what we saw is at Lazarus' funeral, when people were crying, he wept. What we see when he saw the loss of the dream of Jerusalem, and he looked at the beautiful city of Jerusalem and what had happened to it, and he wept. There in the Garden of Gethsemane, just before the crucifixion, you could see the anguish and the feeling, and he went and experienced that. And then finally, when he's on the cross, and he's hanging there, and the emotional pain of the physical pain, then the emotional pain of thinking that my creation that I love, they did this to me. Can't even imagine what that was like. And then the spiritual pain of separation from his Father. And he cries out on the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me? He just let it go. He just experienced it. And that's a model for us. It's okay. And I have people go, yeah, but I'm afraid if I let it go, it's never going to end. It's never going to end. I don't know what will happen. The truth is, we know what will happen. It does end. Emotions have a shelf life. They don't go on and on. We're not reading about, people went into a coma again because they were sad. Or, we got to carry them out on a stretcher. It ends. And it's good to go through it and let it be there. So that's responding to ourselves. What about how do we respond to others' pain and grief? A couple of scriptures Paul gives us. He says, rejoice with those who rejoice, weep with those who weep. If one member suffers, all suffer together with it. If one member is honored, all rejoice together with it. Now you are the body of Christ and individually members of it. So what he's saying is, just like Richard Rohr in that quote on the Beatitudes says, we become in solidarity with, we embrace and weep with each other when it's sadness. And often what happens is, I don't know about you, but it's really uncomfortable to see people hurting and sad. And sometimes I want to just comfort myself and maybe make their pain go away. So sometimes people get caught up. It's like, I need to say this thing, and so we, come up with a cliche or something. And those aren't helpful. Things like, well, God needed his angel in heaven more than on earth. Or, God needed to teach you something through this. Really? So my 4-year-old died? He needed to teach me something? No, those aren't helpful. But often, we're so uncomfortable with our own pain and their pain that, we want to do something to fix it and make it go away. But we don't. The thing to do is to weep with those who weep. And a lot of times people say, I just don't know what to say when I see people hurting like that. So here it is. I want to give you the perfect response. Okay? 2 perfect responses. So, I'm a professional, okay? I don't think I'm a professional in anything, maybe brushing my teeth. I think I get that wrong. But I'm a professional licensed counselor. I'm a pastor. And so, we're supposed to have all the right responses. And so, many of you know and remember Deb Sherman when she was here. I just saw that she posted something on Facebook. Her husband Larry died, and there was a picture of Larry with his grandkids, years back. And, they had dreams. The dream of, retiring and going to be with their kids and their grandkids. And just suddenly Larry dies. Just this sudden thing. What an earthquake. What a horrible thing. And I remember going to the funeral, and the funeral was not at Crossroads, but they came to Crossroads, but we went to another church because it was a big funeral. And I remember before the service started, I saw Deb, and she was up near the front, and I walked down the aisle, and I thought, so I need to give the perfect response. The one that is well balanced with a little hope, some empathy, something that will just lift her up and buoy her up in this time of need. The perfect professional response. So I came up and I looked at Deb and she looked at me and I said, this sucks. And she gave the perfect pastor's wife response. She said, it does suck. And then we hugged. And if you know Deb, we hugged for a long time because she could hug, right? Yeah, because it does suck. Because it's not God's plan. He didn't create death. That was a result of sin. He conquered death. And so death is something he cries and mourns over. It sucks. I don't know if pastors are supposed to say that, but it sucks. I'll find out after, right, Joe? I'll send them your way. You'll forward the forward button. So I told her I'd give you 2 perfect responses. That was the first one. The second one is like, let's say you're somewhere at a funeral home or somewhere and you see somebody, they're really hurting. They're sitting there in their pain. And you come up and there they are. That's it. Right? I'm there. That's it. And oftentimes that's all we need. It's the perfect response. That person knows you're there for me. So, putting it all together, getting to our last one. So we want to be recognizing the types, the impact, responding to ourselves, responding to others by feeling the pain, by weeping with those who weep. And then finally, recovering, the process of recovering. And I don't really like that word. Even the people who wrote that book about sadness don't really like the word, even though they used it. So I think a better one is rebuilding. Because you never really recover from some losses. There's always something there. And so rebuilding really is a better picture. And in this process, if you've gone through the feelings and you've let that happen, it's sort of like those intense feelings start to dial down a little, and then you start to pick yourself up and go, okay, what do I got here? Where do I go from here? What does that look like? Well, Hopefully it doesn't look like Chevy Chase's vacation, but it might. So, what's a kid's common road trip question? Yeah, look at that. Are we there yet? Somebody blogging about grief, and I altered this a little bit, this quote, because to make it fit to a more personal thing. They said this: if grief were a road trip, it would be one with a back seat full of children saying, "Are we there yet? Are we close? This is taking too long." Because it just seems like, wow, is this ever going to get better? I'm trying, I'm picking up, I'm starting to go. But when you think about rebuilding, we just had a big, the big loss with the cathedral there in Paris with Notre Dame. And now they're in this process where they're thinking about in the process of rebuilding. And sometimes that's what it feels like. It's like this huge mess. Where do I start? It's overwhelming. What do I do? And they're saying to rebuild this is going to be decades or 10 years or quite a while. And it won't be the same. It'll never be exactly like it was. It can't be. But it takes time. And it might look like I go and take one charred piece of wood out and I throw it out and then I need a rest. And I just keep doing that. It takes time. So part of it's knowing, recognizing it takes time in the rebuilding process. I remember my mom who'd been, lost 2 husbands, had a son die in her arms, experienced a lot of loss. And when I was going through one of my really hard times that I had described, she just said, give it time. Normally I would have thought, I don't know if I would have liked that answer from anyone else, but from her, it was perfect. So when we think about rebuilding, a lot of new things start to happen too. You might take on new roles. If you lose, I remember when my dad died, who's the man of the house? You take on new roles. You start to take on new identities. Often our identities get tied up in our work, in a job, or in a relationship, and now that's gone and we need a new identity. Maybe it's a new meaning. What does life mean to me now? Maybe it's a new attitude, how I approach life. All these things start to happen that are new. And when we think about ancient Israel, and when their temple, like Notre Dame, got totally destroyed, right down foundation, everything, and by enemies. And then they were taken captive for 70 years. And after 70 years, they came back and they start rebuilding their beautiful temple. And they laid the foundation. And they said, let's have a party, let's have a celebration, because we're starting to rebuild. And some of the people that were there were the old people who remembered the first temple. And when we're rebuilding, it's a mix between, I don't totally forget, because people often say, yeah, but if I go on with this, I'm going to be disrespecting and not remembering them. No, it's a both and. It's not an either or. You both remember and you both still stay connected with what was and how that's sad, and you're doing new things in the present. And so this beautiful picture happens at this party where you got the older people who remembered the old and they were sad, and the other people who were really joyful because something was being rebuilt. And we see this in the book of Ezra. But many of the older priests and Levites and family heads who had seen the former temple wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while many others shouted for joy. No one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise and the sound was heard far away. This is such a beautiful picture of what rebuilding is like, because there's like these two things going on. The sadness of what I remember and the newness and the joys that are coming with the new things. So the last thing to leave us with on a hopeful note, I hope a hopeful note, is when we go back to our scripture, happy the mourning, because they shall be comforted. And we do receive comfort now, but we also know there's an ultimate comfort. There's an ultimate hope. Joe often says we don't mourn as Christians, we don't mourn as people with no hope. There is a hope. And when John the Apostle saw the vision of the future, and we see in the book of Revelation, he says this, "And I heard a loud voice from the throne saying, 'See, the home of God is among mortals. He will dwell with them. They will be his peoples, and God himself will be with them. He will wipe away every tear from their eyes. Death will be no more. Mourning and crying and pain will be no more. For the first things,'" that's what we're living right now, "the first things have passed away. And the one who was seated on the throne said, 'See, I'm making all things new.' Also he said, 'Write this, for these words are trustworthy and true.'" And that's the hope, because they are trustworthy and true. There will be a time when all that mourning will be gone, because death is now gone forever. But in the meantime, we want to be able to experience the loss and feel it and let God work and heal us in that. So, simple question as our call to faith. Two simple questions. Is there someone, some dream, some loss I need to embrace the process of grief in? Or how about, is there some other person in my life I've been maybe uncomfortable to be around them because of that grief, and I just need to weep with them?